Hi, everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're joining us today because we are tackling one of the absolute most fascinating intellectual puzzles out there. We are diving into the ultimate demarcation line. Think about it. Every single day, we're bombarded with claims. Some are rock-solid science, while others, well, they're just pseudoscience wearing a lab coat. But what exactly is the fundamental challenge in defining what constitutes real science? How do we actually draw that line? Well, today we're going to unpack the incredible history and the philosophy behind that exact question. So, how do we separate real science from clever illusions? I mean, it sounds simple enough, right? You'd think, if it has data, it's science. If it doesn't, it's not. But as we're going to see, this boundary, what philosophers call the demarcation problem, is actually incredibly blurry. It's like a giant puzzle. We're going to explore this intellectual mystery together. And I promise you, by the end of this explainer, you're going to look at scientific claims in a totally different way. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to hit the demarcation problem, Karl Popper's bold idea, the falsifiability test, cracks in the criterion, and wrap it all up with a two-dimensional solution. Let's jump right into Section 1, the demarcation problem, the historical puzzle. You see, this isn't just some modern issue born in the internet age. People have been wrestling with this for millennia. Let's rewind all the way back to the 5th century BC. The Greek physician Hippocrates wrote a text about epilepsy, which, back then, everybody called the sacred disease. Hippocrates desperately wanted to separate his physiological, medical theory about the disease from the wild claims of magicians and faith healers, who basically just blamed it on the gods. He had to draw a line in the sand to establish real authority, and honestly, this was one of humanity's earliest recorded attempts at demarcation. He was literally trying to kick the charlatans out of the medical tent. Moving right along to Section 2, Karl Popper's bold idea, the risky bet. Fast forward with me to early 20th century Vienna. The city is just buzzing with revolutionary ideas. And there's this philosopher, Karl Popper, who's watching a massive clash of intellectual titans. On one hand, he's looking at Albert Einstein's theories of physics. On the other hand, he's looking at the psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud and the historical theories of Karl Marx. And Popper notices something really interesting. Freud and Marx had these incredibly flexible frameworks. It didn't matter what human behavior or economic event happened, their followers could perfectly explain it, but only in hindsight. Their theories just adapted to fit any data. But Einstein was making what Popper called a risky bet. He was making highly specific predictions about the physical universe that could easily be disproven. If his predictions were wrong, boom, his entire theory would collapse. Which brings us to Section 3, the falsifiability test. A strict standard. So, Popper realized something crucial. Being able to prove a theory right just isn't enough. Why? Because a clever theorist can find proof literally everywhere. He needed a much stricter standard. And that brings us to the core intellectual takeaway for you today, falsifiability. Popper declared that the true criterion for a scientific theory is its capacity to be proven wrong through rigorous testing. Basically, if there is no conceivable experiment or observation that could possibly shatter your theory, well, you aren't really doing science. You're doing something else. A real scientific theory has to stick its neck out. Okay, so here is the ultimate example of a risky bet in action. May 29, 1919. A British expedition led by astronomers Arthur Eddington and Frank Dyson sets out to test Einstein's theory of general relativity during a solar eclipse. Now, Einstein's theory predicted that the gravity of a massive object, like the sun, would actually bend the starlight traveling right past it. Eddington and Dyson measured the light, and guess what? It bent exactly as Einstein predicted. It was a monumental, dangerous prediction. It could have entirely destroyed Einstein's theory right then and there if the light hadn't bent. But because it was so highly falsifiable, yet actually survived the test, Popper viewed this as the absolute gold standard of real science. But of course, things get messy. Section 4, cracks in the criterion, the real world's complication. Falsifiability sounds like a totally perfect solution, right? It gives us this clean, sharp line. But let's think about the real world for a second. Let's say you're testing a brilliant theory and your experiment just totally fails. Did you just scientifically disprove the theory? Or, is your equipment just broken? In the real world, laboratories are messy, instruments fail, conditions are almost never perfect. Case in point. Right after that triumphant 1919 solar eclipse test we just talked about, observatories out in California attempted to replicate those exact same results, and they failed completely. Now, if we strictly follow falsifiability, they should have thrown Einstein's theory of general relativity right into the trash bin. But obviously, that would have been a massive disaster. It turned out the California observatories just had faulty conditions for their tests. So this clearly shows us that rejecting a massive scientific theory based on a single failed test is actually incredibly dangerous. And these real-world complications, they didn't just stay in the laboratory. They completely spilled over into the legal system. American courts really struggled with this philosophical line. Just look at how this evolved over time. Back in the famous 1925 Scopes monkey trial, the battle over teaching evolution began. By 1982 in McLean Barn, Arkansas, Judge William Overton actually used Karl Popper's falsifiability test in his ruling to separate science from creationism. But science and our understanding of it isn't static. By the time we hit the 2005 Kitzmiller v. Dover trial regarding intelligent design, Judge John E. Jones III actually had to abandon Popper's strict one-dimensional rule. The courts realized the legal system needed a much more nuanced, updated approach to define what science actually is. So why did the courts eventually move away from Popper? Well, philosopher Larry Ladon pointed out a hilarious but absolutely critical flaw in 1983. He said, look, if falsifiability is the only rule, then as long as you make a claim that can be tested and disproven, you're technically being scientific. And that means flat earthers, Loch Ness monster hunters, or Goenbox supporters, astrologers, and people trying to build perpetual motion machines, they're all accidentally validated as practitioners of science, simply because their bizarre claims can be tested. Obviously, drawing a single rigid line of demarcation just wasn't cutting it anymore. So what's the fix? Section 5. A two-dimensional solution. Mapping the landscape. It was time for philosophy to ditch the simple one-dimensional line and map out a much more accurate landscape of human knowledge. Enter philosopher Massimo Pigliucci. Instead of a simple pass/fail line, he proposed a two-dimensional landscape. Think of it like this. On the vertical axes, you've got empirical knowledge, basically how much hard, observable data something actually has. Then, on the horizontal axis, you have theoretical understanding, which is how deep and logically sound the underlying theory actually is. Suddenly, the line of demarcation bends into this really complex, fascinating territory. To really ground this, let's picture where things sit on this map. Way up in the top right corner, that's high theory and high empirical knowledge, you find your robust sciences, things like evolutionary biology and particle physics. They have huge amounts of data and incredibly strong theoretical frameworks. But if you look down in the bottom left, low theory and low empirical knowledge, that's where you find things like astrology and intelligent design. They completely lack both deep explanatory power and physical proof. By mapping it out like this, we can clearly see the whole spectrum of knowledge without accidentally giving a scientific stamp of approval to the Loch Ness monster. But as we wrap up today, we really have to remember one last absolutely crucial point. Science is, by its very nature, dynamic. Even within real, rigorous science, facts are constantly evolving based on new evidence. Just look at these shifts. If you went to school before 2006, you were absolutely taught that Pluto was a planet. Now, it's a dwarf planet. If you loved dinosaurs as a kid, you definitely pictured them as these giant bearskin reptiles. Now, the scientific consensus points to many of them being feather-covered ancestors of modern birds. Discarding old theories when new evidence arrives isn't a failure of science, guys. It is literally the exact mechanism of how science works. It's a beautifully self-correcting process. So, I want to leave you with this provocative final thought. If the line of science is always moving, always updating and refining itself, what facts that we hold absolutely true today will become the outdated science, or maybe even the pseudoscience, of tomorrow? It's a great reminder to stay curious, stay completely open to new evidence, and to always keep questioning the world around you. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.